Welcome back, everyone, to our final speaker before we take the break and then come back to have a panel with all of them. And this speaker is filmmaker Tracy Torme. Tracy, welcome to the event.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really gotta say, Tracy is the man, and I'll tell you why. Hollywood is a very difficult empire, per se. He gave a voice to Travis and Debbie. Rather than making a film like Independence Day where the aliens are trying to kill us, he brought the truth to the table. And for that reason, you guys, give him another round of applause.
Thank you.
Let's go back to, when did you start getting interested in UFOs?
Well, I was always kind of interested growing up, but where I started getting involved with abductions was when I was 20 years old. I lucked out and got a sort of a dream job with a show called SCTV, which was filmed in Toronto. Some of you might remember the show with John Candy and Rick Moranis and all those guys. So when I was 20 years old, my very first weekend, there I am, an American, 20 years old in Canada, knowing nobody. And the weekend came on and I thought, what am I going to do? So I actually went for a walk and ended up in a bookstore. And in the bookstore, there was this book with a bright orange cover that was out of place. It was sitting by itself apart from all the other books, and it was Missing Time.
Bud Hopkins.
Bud Hopkins, who I had never heard of at the time, and I'd never heard of the book. So I picked it up and started reading it and was absolutely fascinated by it. And my dad was in New York performing at the time, and I called my dad and I said, I'm going to try to see if I can find this Bud Hopkins guy. If I find him, will you sort of take a look at some of his stuff and see if you think it's worthwhile? So I looked Bud Hopkins up in the phone book, called him up, had like a 3-hour conversation with him. My dad went over to his house in Greenwich Village and looked at the same kind of stuff that Debbie was showing you, the drawings of the aliens and things. I said to my dad, what do you make of this? My dad said, if these people are acting, they could teach Olivier some lessons. It's exactly what he said. So I decided that I wanted to make Missing Time, and I bought the rights to Missing Time. And when my job at SCTV was over, I hadn't been home in a long time, and you'd think I'd want to come home immediately. But I decided to make a detour to New York and spend a week with Bud Hopkins. Mm-hmm. So I spent a week with Bud Hopkins in New York, and then came back to Hollywood, deciding that this was the UFO movie I wanted to make. I wanted to make Missing Time. And little did I know that Hollywood thought this was the strangest subject of all time. This was in the days before people had seen the little guys with the big heads and the big eyes. It was all new. So I spent 3 long years trying to sell Missing Time. And at the end of that 3-year period, I decided the problem was not that abductions would not make a good movie. The problem was maybe I didn't have the right abduction story. Missing Time was too general. And that's how when I first decided to try to find Travis Walton.
And so you made Fire in the Sky, okay, because 3 major films, in case you guys aren't aware, a television series, Intruders, based on Debbie, then of course the blockbuster film Fire in the Sky with Travis Walton, and you also worked on Contact. What was the order? Which one did you make first?
First was actually Intruders.
Intruders.
Yeah.
Okay, so when you said you couldn't make Missing Time, you weren't finding the right abductee, is that when Bud led you to Debbie?
Well, what happened was, this is the key ingredient here. I decided after SCTV I did not want to be a TV comedy writer. And I thought that was the end of my comedy career. And the next day, practically, Saturday Night Live called me and offered me a job. And I thought I'd have to be crazy not to take this job. I hadn't even watched Saturday Night Live in a long, long time, and I was really not that qualified for it, but I thought, well, I've got to take this job. But what that meant was that I was now going to move to New York City. And guess who lives in New York City?
Bud Hopkins.
So Bud Hopkins saw in me somebody that sort of understood the subject, was not writing a book, was not part of any UFO organization. So I think he felt it was safe to trust me. So this began my year in New York City, where I first met Debbie and was lucky enough to sit in on her sessions and be the sort of the witness. And I started on a regular basis going over to Bud Hopkins and sitting in on his hypnosis sessions. And felt very privileged. And I can only describe to you how strange it would be. I would leave Saturday Night Live, go to Greenwich Village, hang out at Bud Hopkins' house for 2 or 3 hours, watching women and men scream and cry and thrash around under hypnosis. And then I would grab a cab and go back to Saturday Night Live and go back to work. And I would literally say to myself, this stuff can't be real. But yet the power of what I was witnessing on a regular basis convinced me that it was real. And also I happened to be there with Bud as he made his discoveries and as he wrestled with how to tell the world these discoveries. I can very clearly remember him saying to me, Tracy, I realize now if you're not taken as a child, they're not going to take you. It all starts in childhood. I said, really? He said, yeah. Then another time he said, well, I'm going to get blasted, but there's a sexual component to all of this. And when I write this, people are going to think I'm Looney Tunes, and I don't want to do it. I know I'm going to get attacked, but that's where the evidence is taking me. So as he made all of his discoveries step by step about abductions, including the hybrids, which was a very big one, the hybrid children and the women with the strange pregnancies that disappeared, I was along for the ride, just as sort of the silent witness that sat in and was lucky enough that when I sat in on her sessions, she was kind enough to trust me and know that I wasn't going to go out and try to betray her in any way. But I really gained a lot of empathy for the abductees, because I really did feel like I was never comfortable with the fact that they were never asked their permission, that these things were thrust upon them and they were forced to do these things whether they liked it or not. And I thought, well, that's human beings being treated like lab animals, and I didn't like it, and I still don't.
Hollywood can be extremely vicious. How did they feel about you taking, rather than what they've been doing for 50, 60 years, creating films where extraterrestrials are coming here to kill us, how did they feel that you were going to make a series based on a true event?
Well, it's interesting because Intruders really was originally a project called They Are Among Us. It was not Intruders. Bud Hopkins and John Mack were consultants on the project. The screenwriter, the original screenwriter for it, was losing his mind, kind of. There's something about the material that really affected him and screwed him up. And about halfway through trying to write the first script, he kind of had a nervous breakdown. And they came to me and they offered me the job. The first thing I did, I said, if you got Bud Hopkins, let's call it Intruders. I think that's 100 times better than They Are Among Us. It sounds like a bad zombie movie.
Yes, yes, agreed.
And I tried to sort of encompass, if anyone ever sees Intruders, and I just watched it for the first time in like 20 years recently. I had sort of forgotten it, it had been so long, but we tried to sort of encompass a fictional story that brought all elements of sort of what Bud Hopkins and John Mack were discovering. I spent a lot of time with John Mack. I sat in on his sessions too. He had big group therapy sessions where he had 20 or 30 abductees at one time over to his place in Boston. And I got, again, very lucky enough to be the witness and to sit in and watch all of these hypnosis sessions. But that's really the reason that Intruders does not really mirror the book that much, because it was sort of created out of whole cloth.
What stood out the most out of all of these sessions that you were a part of?
I think the fact that here was a Twilight Zone episode right in front of my eyes that was real. I mean, when I would come back from witnessing these sessions, quite often there was tremendous terror involved. There was tremendous amount of emotions involved. The scientific community, the psychiatric community, I should say, none of them had the guts that Yvonne has. They were all running away from this stuff. They were all in total denial about it. Bud was really kind of desperate to have partners that had scientific credentials that would verify that this, as crazy as this stuff sounds, it really was happening. And I think what really struck me was that you couldn't fabricate, as a fictional writer, as a writer of fiction, if you tried to make up story of the human race being experimented upon in such a widespread way, where hybrid children are being created that are crosses between us and them, and pregnancies are being terminated, and women are mysteriously going from being pregnant to suddenly there's no fetus, it's gone. And I mean, you put all that stuff together, it's pretty out there. Yet I was convinced that it was real.
This truth is truly stranger than fiction.
I think so.
Like you said, I don't know if anyone could make this up out of their own mind with extraterrestrials coming and merging and creating hybrids.
Well, we came very close for 3 years to making the movie of Missing Time. Mm-hmm. In fact, if some of you know the director, Tony Scott, mm-hmm. who's the brother of Ridley Scott, who died of a suicide recently, he was really interested in abductions. So he was attached to the project for a while, and we came very close until finally one day a light bulb went off over my head, and I said, what's the best abduction story of all time? Travis Walton. So I did my tried and true method that had served me well before. I decided to call the White Pages in Arizona and found out that Travis Walton had had an unlisted number for 10 years and had just put his name back in the phone book a couple of days ago. So I called Travis and I told him who I was and what I wanted to do. He was extremely suspicious of me right off the bat. He'd been burned by Hollywood types in the past. He was not very up for this at all. I finally convinced him, let me come to Arizona and spend some time with you and tell you what my vision is for this movie and see if I can change your mind. So I found out that the only way to get to him was to fly into Phoenix and then fly a small little not even a commuter plane, a private plane, to the White Mountains where Travis lived. So I landed in Phoenix and I went to find the pilot, and he came up and he said, I can't take you. There's a really bad storm in the White Mountains and I'm not doing it. I said, listen, I've got to be back in LA in a couple of days. I'll pay you double, just take me there. And he wouldn't do it. So I ended up renting a 4-wheel drive Peugeot, thinking that if I got any snow anywhere, that I would be able to handle it. So I'm driving out of Phoenix, and I'm 2 hours out of Phoenix on my way to meet Travis Walton when it starts to snow really badly in Arizona, of all places.
Hold on, say that again, please.
When I started to drive...
What's happening? Feedback?
Somebody's moving. Okay, we'll try it again.
They don't want me to tell this story.
I know, apparently not. Wouldn't be the first time mainstream shuts things down.
So I'm 2 hours out of Phoenix, it starts to snow, and I find out, much to my surprise, that the windshield wipers don't work. So literally my first time meeting Travis, I drove the last couple of hours through the desert in a blazing snowstorm, sticking my head out the window, being sure that a truck was going to plow into me from behind at any moment. But I finally got up there and I met Travis and I met Mike Rogers, and I convinced these two guys to take me back to the site itself, where I believe they hadn't been in about 10 years. I could be wrong, but I think that's my memory. And we drove out to the site, and I actually asked them to recreate the entire incident step by step. Show me exactly where you parked the truck. Show me exactly what you did and when you did it. And when I came back from Arizona, I can honestly say that when I'd gone to Arizona, I was not sure this story was real. I thought there was a real good chance there was a hoax and that there was something else to it, and that I still was interested in making the movie. So that wouldn't have changed my mind. But the thing that swayed me was meeting Travis and the other guys, but mainly Travis, because once you get to know Travis, he has so much integrity and he's such a straightforward guy. He's the last guy in the world that would lie about this story. And the more you get to know him, the more confident you are about that. So very quickly, that's another story that I started off as an agnostic, but by the time I came back to Los Angeles, I was convinced that the story was real.
For those of you who missed a radio show we did with Travis and Tracy, with actually Debbie, who is hour one, you explained to everybody why there was the differences in what really happened in Travis's story versus what happened in the film. Do you mind explaining to everybody here why there were the differences,
Sure.
why it wasn't purely as Travis had went through?
Well, the great irony was we were in pre-production on Fire in the Sky when Intruders was rerun on the network. My own show shot me in the foot because somebody at Paramount saw Intruders, saw little men with big heads and big eyes standing over people on tables, and he suddenly freaked out the next day and threatened to pull the plug on the project, which was quite a ways down the road. Said, "We're not going to do it. It's been done. We're not doing it." The only way they would make the movie is if we fictionalized the abduction sequence and made it unique to Fire in the Sky and separated it from what he had seen on Intruders. And I knew right away that that was not at all what I wanted to do. In fact, the original script for Fire in the Sky, the entire sequence from when Travis wakes up and regains consciousness to when he's dropped off outside of Heber, Arizona, I just followed what he had written almost 100% to the T. I didn't fictionalize it at all. It was the original script that came out, just followed what he had written because I thought it was so compelling. And again, I thought I could fictionalize it, but it wouldn't be any better than it is already. But now all of a sudden, the only way we could make the movie was to fictionalize that sequence. What we tried to do was do things in an allegorical way. An example would be, Travis talked about the feeling of claustrophobia when he was on board the ship. So we did the scene where they put the mask over his face and he can't breathe. That's an example of the way we were trying to sort of stay true to the real story, but still fictionalize it enough to make Paramount happy. So I knew what was coming, so I wrote an open letter to the entire world of ufology in the MUFON Journal, and I said, we fictionalized this, you're all gonna see it, you're gonna see it's fictionalized, it wasn't my choice, it's the only way we could make the movie. So about half the people read that and realized that that's really not what the film was about. The film was more about the betrayal of the friends and whether they had murdered him or not. And that's really what we tried to make the film about. But about half of the UFO people, despite what I'd written, were furious. They were just absolutely, said this is the worst example of Hollywoodizing a film ever, and they acted like I'd never even tried to explain it. So at first I kind of had a chip on my shoulder about it, and I really felt like, why don't they see what the bigger film is all really about? Because I always saw the film as mainly about Travis and his best friend, and how his best friend in a moment of panic drove off and left him, and that they would have to work that out over the years, and Travis would end up marrying his sister. So there's all these ties there. That's where I always saw the drama of the film, and that's where I still see the drama of the film. But there were a lot of UFO people that were really, really pissed off at us for fictionalizing what we did. And over the years, I've actually become much more sympathetic with them, because if I could do it over again, and if I have my way again, I might have tried by hook or by crook to resist and maintain the total integrity of the film. But at the time, it seemed like it was the only way to get the film made.
And that's the sad part, that had they known about the phenomena, they would have realized that those large-eyed extraterrestrials were everywhere around the world. Anyway, we are going to take a short break, everybody. We'll be right back, so much more with Tracy Torme. Okay, we are back with Tracy Torme. Big round of applause, everybody. Fire in the Sky was a blockbuster. You had D.B. Sweeney and Robert Patrick, of all people. He had just come off Terminator 2, which was an enormous blockbuster. And therefore, by having such a huge names attached to your film, it just created that much more hype. Personally, I didn't even know what the film was about, but because I was such a Terminator fan, I just went to go see it because Robert Patrick was there and, of course, was blown away. Do you think that after you made the film that the world sort of changed with their perception of abductions? I mean, what was the feedback you were getting?
I think it really opened up a lot of eyes to abductions, much more than Intruders had done, because Intruders was, even though it was a mini-series, it was a TV show. And there's nothing like the power of a movie in a movie theater. I mean, it really, if you can captivate the audience. And Paramount had actually been losing money for a long time. Fire in the Sky was the first film in ages that made a good amount of money for them. Robert Patrick actually was never on our radar screen originally. He somehow heard about the script. He drove to Arizona and actually sat outside of Mike Rogers' house and watched him work in his yard, long before he ever read for us. That's how badly he wanted the part. And when I first heard, we're thinking about this guy for Mike Rogers, and they explained to me it was the Terminator, it was the guy that was the melting Terminator from Terminator 2. I said, are you out of your mind? I mean, but then he was so wed to wanting that role, and he made that role his own. He really did. And you know, and I'm saying this in front of Travis, in many ways, it's more Mike Rogers' movie than it is Travis's movie. It's about Travis, and it's about what happened to Travis, and of course it's about the incredible adjustment he had to make when he returned after 5 days and finding out he was now a household name. Of course, it's Travis's movie too, but in a lot of ways it's really Mike Rogers' movie, because he, in a moment of humanity, of sheer terror and panic, he left his best friend, then had to talk everybody else into going back. None of them wanted to go back. They didn't want to go back at all. He practically had to force them to go back to the spot, and they go back to the spot, and Travis is gone. And now Mike Rogers has to turn around and go tell his sister, who's going to be Travis's wife, I left him. Sorry. And that just fascinated me from a storytelling point of view, and still does. I mean, I think Mike Rogers is still a damaged person because of what happened. Now, Travis, on the other hand, I've watched him over the years just deal with this in a better and better and better and better way. He's now at ease to talk about it, and he's now very analytical and very, what's the word I'm looking for? He's able to sit with a group of people and be at ease talking about the experience. He was nowhere near that when I first met him. And I don't think Mike Rogers is to this day. I think Mike Rogers is still haunted by what happened.
During the time you spent filming the movie, did your perceptions on alien abduction change in any way for the better or for worse?
Not really, because I'd spent so much time with Hopkins and I'd seen so many things. You know, one thing that I think is some of the most powerful evidence that abductions are real, and I've never even talked about this with Yvonne before, but I think this is extremely powerful. The Betty and Barney Hill case, the seminal case that I'm assuming most people know about. Barney Hill refused to let them put one thing in the book, The Interrupted Journey. He said, if you put this in the book, I'm dropping out and I'm not going to back you guys. And that was that they artificially ejaculated him and took his sperm. He was so ashamed of that is not in the book about the Interrupted Journey, the book about Betty and Barney Hill. So Bud Hopkins ends up pursuing abductions and finds this sexual component that they're taking sperm and ova from people. And what's puzzling is, well, it's not in the Betty and Barney Hill story. Yes, it is. It just wasn't in the book because they held it out. Now, is that a coincidence? To me, again, that's not a coincidence. That's, again, they were doing the same things to Betty and Barney Hill that they were doing to the people that Yvonne works with, that they were doing to real abductees. They use us, they use our biological material to create something in between us and them. Crazy as that sounds, Twilight Zone, I'm the first one to admit it, that seems to be what they're doing. And when you look at the hybrids and you look at the hybrid children that people have met before, they're almost a perfect cross between us and them.
Speaking of the hybrids, what's your take on them? Because one branch says that they're creating them so they could replace us in case we kill ourselves. Another branch says that they're being created so they can even evade. That's what Dr. Jacobs thinks. Other people think that so they can assimilate themselves into our society. What do you think personally?
I think they're using these hybrid children somewhere else in the universe for their own purpose. And I think their purpose is very mysterious. They have their own reason for wanting to create a cross between us and them. And whether they're populating worlds with the hybrids, it seems like it's an experiment in progress that they are trying to continually rework the crossbreeding between us and them. Now, if I was to tell you that I had any idea why they're doing that, I'd be lying. Because I think that's one of the keys to the whole UFO mystery that's missed by the entire world, is that there is a thought process behind the entire UFO mystery that is non-human. They don't think the way we think. So therefore they do things that don't seem to make a total lot of sense when we analyze them. I firmly believe that, and I believe that abductions fit that category too. They definitely have a purpose, they definitely know what they're doing, and they definitely are following certain steps. They definitely don't want us to know about it. And that's something else that I feel strongly about. Everything we learn about it, I really feel we learn despite them, not because of them. It's obvious that they like to do what they're doing in a secret as much as they can.
I'm going to give you a statement, then I want to ask you what your take is on it. I think rather than studying ships, sightings, and reports, the way we're going to get to the bottom of the truth is ask the abductees. Why? Because they're the ones that have interaction with them. The way we're going to find out how they act, what they look like, how they deal with their ships, how they deal with each other, We need to deal with them directly. I think that's why alien abduction is probably the most important topic in ufology.
I think that's a really good point, but I also think that even the abductees are kept in the dark a lot. I think that they don't really, and I don't know again how like Yvonne would feel about this, but I don't think they want us as a human race to know more than we have to know about what they're doing. I think they want to do what they're doing behind closed doors as much as they can. And that's again the part of the whole abduction phenomena that makes me uneasy. It's been written about my work in this field that I have a very negative attitude towards abductions, or there was a long essay about it, and it was true, because I don't think we should be put on tables and experimented on without our giving our permission. I just don't think so.
Media, especially Hollywood, is probably one of the biggest ways of education, and by you having a film such as Fire in the Sky out there, I think does great wonders to educate all four corners of the globe. Do you have any other projects next going down the same lines? Are you going to do anything else on alien abductions or UFOs in general?
Well, I'm working on a film right now called 701, which is going to try to be sort of the seminal UFO film since Close Encounters. And we are not doing anything on abductions. We're not doing anything on Roswell. And the only reason is because we feel like it's been done so much. We're trying to be a little more unique. I was approached about doing the Betty and Barney Hill story. And I actually did go out to a couple of studios, and we sort of did a couple of trial balloons to see if there was a market for it. And I reread The Interrupted Journey, which I was sure that I had read when I was very young, and then I realized, no, I've actually never read this before. So that still interests me, because I think the interracial marriage aspect of the Betty and Barney Hill story is very interesting. I mean, they were an interracial marriage in the early 60s at a time when you had to have a lot of courage just to do that. And I think that that part of that story, just as the Mike Rogers guilt part of the Travis Walton story, it appeals to me. I think that Betty and Barney Hill and how they fit into society when they were abducted does really interest me. So it's a possible that I might end up going back to that and doing something with that. But I had actually decided after Fire in the Sky that I've said what I need to say about UFOs, and I'm done. Because everybody that wanted to make a UFO film has been approaching me for years, and I've been turning them down for a long time. But then after a certain amount of time, I've come to accept that I think this is a very, very, very important and misunderstood subject. It's not understood by the world. It's very misunderstood. So I think that there is still a place to say something to the world about it, and that's why I'm doing 701.
I know what 701 means. Some people out here might 701, or many of them might know what it means, but can you tell them why 701?
Well, when Project Blue Book was operating for the Air Force from 47 to 69, I believe, this is what you need to understand to really understand why we chose the title 701. If the Air Force had a sighting, let's say 10 people saw an incredible object, the Air Force said, explained, it was the planet Jupiter, it was very bright that night in the western sky. And they would put it down as explained, and it would be listed as an explained case. Then an astronomer might come along and say, wait a minute, Jupiter was not even visible on that part of the Earth at the time of this sighting. Well, the Air Force would then not take that case and say, okay, it's not explained. It's back to unexplained. They would just leave it explained. So there are a ton of cases which have hideously bad explanations for them that are officially considered explained cases. But the Air Force admitted when they shut down Project Blue Book that they had 701 completely unexplained cases. Now, those are really unexplained cases, because if they're listing them as unexplained, they're as unexplained as you can get. So we thought it was kind of an ironic title to call the film 701, because that's really shows you the way people have been hoodwinked over the years to think that this is a silly subject and that there's nothing to it.
And going back to it all, we only need one to prove to the entire world, and there are tens of thousands of cases to choose from. Just out of these 701, if we can just get one to the mainstream, then we'd be fine. Now, let's talk about Contact, because you worked on that. How did you get involved in that film, and what was your take on it? Because it didn't go the way I expected it. I expected when she built, the machine was built, that she would end up on some planet and not the way it ended, where it didn't exist except for that NSA report. How did you feel about the movie? How did you get involved and the ending?
I was one of two writers brought in right from the beginning to adapt Carl Sagan's book. Sort of ended up that the other writer was, this is going to sound bad, but it's the truth. He was kind of considered the flavor of the month writer. He was the choice of the studio. I was the choice of the producers. So I worked on it for quite a while and had many meetings with them. And a lot of stuff that I brainstormed with them, taken from the book, did make it into the movie. So I'm not a credited writer on it, but I did work on it. There were elements of the movie that I had problems with, like when Jodie Foster comes back from her experience, and after all the incredible things that have happened up till then, nobody believes her. Everybody thinks she's lying. Everybody thinks she's crazy. And I said, no, at this point you've shown so many spectacular things in the movie that there'd be a sizable number of people that would believe her. So that was one of the big things that I didn't like in the film. But overall, I thought it was a good film. I was really proud of the opening sequence in the film, because that was totally my idea, which was to start on something in the universe and keep pulling back and pulling back and pulling back and pulling back till you sort of get a feeling for the size of the universe. And that made it all the way through to the end of the film. So I had mixed feelings about it. I think it's, looking back on it though, it's a pretty good film.
It definitely was. Now this is just your opinion. Are there any other UFO films out there that you think are doing the subject as a whole justice?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I was not a huge fan of Close Encounters when I first saw it. I like it more as the years have gone by, and I think there's more good things in it than I originally admitted to. But I was a little disappointed when I first saw it. UFO films, well, there's a book coming out that I think everybody in this room would probably be interested in, called Saucers and the Silver Screen. And it's about the entire history of UFOs in Hollywood. I did a 5-hour interview with the author, and he was very, very thorough. And if he's as thorough as he was in doing the interview, it's going to be a great book. And there was one other thing that I wanted to say. I'm sorry to digress, but how many people in the room are familiar with David Jacobs? Well, this is just I'll tell this really quickly. When I first was going to New York to meet with Bud Hopkins on that first trip coming back to Los Angeles, I met with David Jacobs, and I told him about abduction. I was talking about abductions. He was a complete 100% disbeliever in abductions, thought it was absolute nonsense, didn't believe the Betty and Barney Hill story. So I said, you've got to come and see what Hopkins has. So I dragged him to Greenwich Village, and we spent like the day looking at Bud's stuff, a lot of which were drawings made by abductees, similar to the ones that Debbie showed you. And when we finished and we left, Jacob said, well, I'm still not convinced. He goes, it's interesting stuff, but it's still not convinced. And then it turns out the two of them had summer homes. Hopkins and Jacobs both had summer homes near Cape Cod, and they discovered that, and they decided to get together for a second time. And then Jacobs became like one of the great gurus of abductions. It became his total focus.
That's right.
Yeah.
He even taught a course at Temple before he retired. Temple.
And I think he's done great work, by the way. I think he doesn't get the credit that he deserves.
I agree. Now, how would you like other Hollywood producers to treat UFOs rather than Independence Day where they're coming to kill us.
Well, my biggest pet peeve is that anytime there's a UFO story on the news, they have to make the little green man comment at the end before they go to the commercial. Somebody has to say that. So I just think that people that are anti-UFO are generally ignorant of it. That's what I have found. Carl Sagan, who I worked with, very anti-UFO. Gene Roddenberry, who I worked with, absolutely one of the most anti-UFO guys you'll ever meet. Chastised me up and down for wanting to do the Travis Walton story. I mean, literally his face turned red and he was shaking his fist at me. He was so angry about it. Now, I tell Trekkies that, and they can't believe that Gene Roddenberry hated UFOs. He did. So did Carl Sagan. So did, I'm trying to think of another class, Ray Bradbury, Seth Shostak. I was on the 50th anniversary Star Trek panel in Seattle with Seth Shostak, and I said, why are you so wrong about UFOs? And we started to talk about UFOs, and he looked at me like I was talking about Santa Claus. And the people that are against it, they don't believe there's good evidence. They don't believe there's multiple witnesses. They don't believe they're seen by pilots. They're wrong about everything. So that's the frustration. To answer your question, I'd like to see people treat it seriously and as something that has a lot of evidence behind it and is not silly season.
Just as I did with Debbie and Travis, if you have anything to say, one last message to everybody, what would it be?
I think I just did.
There you go. Everybody, thank you, Tracy Torme, for being the voice of abductees for everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I believe we're taking a break.